we do want to always start now with our new format. We're starting with finance. So I want to talk about this. So home prices have been outpacing pay for a long time, and it's still going on. And I just wanted to jump into this article from NPR here, where home prices have far outpaced paychecks. See what it looks like where you live. You can go on to this. This is actually great, and you can look at locations, um, and you can just put it into the table. But just in the United States, and they're just looking at the change since 1990. This is 3.1 is times your income, annual income. So in the 90s, it was common that you could get a house that was 2 or 3 times your income, right? Today, it's more like 5 to 6 times. And so they have it there about where it's 4.9. So homes have gotten to a point where they've been ridiculously expensive. And part of the reason for that is, especially COVID kind of jacked that up. So they have millions of Americans already shut out of buying a home, and the cost of buying a home continues to rise. In the past decades, it was common to find a house that cost roughly 3 times a buyer's annual income, but that ratio has skewed sharply since the COVID-19 pandemic, with home prices up a whopping 47% since early 2020. So take whatever your home was and times it by half, and then add that on. I mean, that's a lot. So home price sales last year were about 5 times the median household income, according to tabulations from a newly released report by the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. So the double whammy of high prices here and high mortgage rates has left homeownership out of reach for all but the most advantaged households. So that's the other thing, is the prices have gone up, and part of the reason is because the market's just been kind of overly hot, overly priced the way it's been set up, especially since COVID, and people moved a lot during COVID. Now it's always kind of been a little bit like this, where it's now cost prohibitive to sell a house to a middle income or lower middle income person. So a lot of these realtors, instead of doing that, they just focus on, well, we'll just make high priced houses because we can sell those to that smaller group of rich people, and for the middle and lower middle income people, we'll just make apartments. And this is kind of a big deal from a financial perspective, because what really built the wealth in this country for the middle class was home ownership. That's why you see, black and Hispanic people, especially, cut out of that, because they weren't, they had redlining, they weren't allowed to buy homes.
Right. Denied access to housing, or provided alternative housing options that
Right.
did not include home ownership.
Right.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to talk about this for a second. So it's one of those things where, maybe you are opposed to owning property, and that's fine. The benefits of it are this. I mean, with rents, if you pay that money every month, it's gone, right? As well with home ownership, some of that money that you pay every month towards the mortgage goes to the interest payment to the bank, and that money's gone. But a portion of it goes to the principal. And the longer you own the home, the more of that money goes to the principal, just the way interest works. What ends up happening is that's paying down what you owe on the house, right? And then the value of the house increases over time, generally. Real estate does, almost, not always, but almost always. So you've built up equity in the house. So ideally, when you're selling the house, now you've got the proceeds, right? So once you pay off what you owe left on the loan, everything else from the sale is yours to pocket.
Duncan, this is it's like, I feel like this feels like a more abstract idea for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like when you make the monthly mortgage payment, that amount that is going to the principal that's paying down your loan,
Right.
you could almost look at it as an amount you are putting into a magical little savings account.
Yes.
And then as your home increases in value, you could look at it as almost like the interest you're earning on that amount in that little magical savings account. If it helps
Absolutely.
to sort of put it in your mind that way, that's kind of what's happening with home ownership.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the idea of equity and how my home builds wealth for me, I think it's such an abstract idea that it's worth kind of like distilling it down to something that feels a little more tangible.
Right. And it's the
And so
whole.
when I picture it like a savings account and then the interest that comes into it, when I can kind of compare it to that, it sort of helps me to like
Right.
bring it into something more tangible.
Right. And it's like investing where it's hard to imagine what we're doing is we're building up a portfolio for 10, 20, 30 years. And it's hard for people to picture that far into the future. A house is the same thing under the added level of you don't really see that growing in an account. It's really the
Right.
equity on the house. So it's kind of like you said, it's a little bit more, it feels like it's more removed, even though it's not, because you physically own the house. Right?
Right.
So
You know,
there's-
it's also worth adding though, what we're talking about, you know, when you rent a place, your monthly payment, that money is just gone, and that's not the same situation with a mortgage.
no.
I feel that I have to put it in there because with the types of clients that I work with in my coaching business, and they're in all sorts of spaces, but many are, you know, don't own homes yet, but are, you know, close to that spot, and that's kind of where they're trying to, you know, get
Right.
a handle on everything else. One of the things that I always feel like we need to bring to the table in discussion, though, is that you have to think about more money monthly for home ownership than just the payment,
Right.
because I've also had clients that were new home owners that weren't totally prepared for that and then found themselves being a little surprised by, oh no, now the furnace is a thing and I have to
Right.
pay for that. Or, you know, this stupid tree in my yard and this branch and it's hitting my roof and I have to pay somebody, an arborist or something. You know,
Right.
there's just all of this stuff that they don't think about that you never had to think about as a renter. So it's also important, don't just look at that monthly payment. You need to, one of the numbers that people float is maybe 2% of the cost per home per year,
Right.
to be mentally sort of tacked on to your expenses, just so you have a more realistic perspective.
Right. So I just wanted to give the sense. So if you're thinking about buying property, it is a good investment over time. Right, as Lacey was saying, you should think about it as a growth thing. But the idea behind buying is it's so cost prohibitive anymore for most people. So you need to look at something that's in your price range. I just going to give this for example. This is not probably within most people's price range, but this is just, I don't know why you buy this house anyway. I don't really like this. This is just one I sort of picked at random. So this one is in Portland. It's $519,000. So just to give you a sense, look at this house. Would you pay $519,000 for this house? Lace?
No, that looks like one of the houses I could have been looking at when I first purchased my house that is in that area in,
Mm-hmm.
it was maybe 2011 or something, but I would have been paying like
Yeah.
like under 200 for that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I would,
Yeah.
yeah.
So just to get that's just show you an example of the wow, it's gotten prohibitive. But here's the deal. So this is just Zillow. You can go on whatever site you want. I just want you to think about this. When you're buying a home, typically as a financial planner, what we're thinking about is what's it going to cost you every month. So Zillow is really nice because they'll give you an estimate. So right here, there's the estimate $3,219 a month for everybody. And what they're doing, the nice thing about Zillow here that I like about them is they're putting in not just the mortgage, but they're also putting in what is the insurance going to be and what are the taxes going to be.
I want to jump in on that taxes thing though. You have to actually double check that they put it in
Right.
right. They put in sort of an estimate. And sometimes when you look at the actual number, it'll tell you the actual number for taxes somewhere else, but that's not the number Zillow put in. So you sometimes have to change those a little bit, but it does give you all those fields that you can play around with it too.
Right. The other thing about buying a house is this. It's not, I mean, if you're buying it and you're just going to live there forever, that's fine. But part of it too is if you're buying the house and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to buy it and then later on I'm going to basically use it as an investment to resell it later or do something, you need to look at what's happened historically with the house. Now this one's an odd one now that I'm looking at it because it sold in 2022 for $40,000. Right? And now in 2024 they're trying to get $500,000 for it. So this one's probably a frickin' lemon. There's something wrong, and I can tell you what it is, but what you want to look at is what did it sell for previously and go back sort of historically. and look at what the tax assessment was. So the tax assessment in 2022 was 110, and now they're saying it's about 112. This is a better sort of gauge on the tax assessment of how much it's growing. So this one's growing roughly about 3%. That's the underlying value. Somebody's trying to get more out of it. I can tell you why with this one just by looking at this, because the square foot of the house is 1,688 feet, which is not very big. It's about twice the size of your standard like 2-bedroom apartment for 4-bed, 2 baths. But the lot size is 5,200 square feet, which is really big. So what they're hoping to do is get this basically purchased by a company who's going to tear it up and build a convenience store or something. Right? Or some sort of equity investment kind of firm. So just to get a sense, you want to look at what's kind of my monthly and get a sense of that. And like Lacey said, double check it, because it's the Zillow estimate is never going to be, or the online estimate is never going to be exact. It's usually close, but sometimes they are way off. So like you said, check
Well,
it.
frequently, like I said, I've had a lot of experience with these, and frequently they're plugging in this sort of arbitrary number for the taxes that's not actually what the taxes. So you have to go down to that thing that you just showed there, where it shows what the taxes were the last year,
right,
and figure out what the monthly taxes would be based on that, because that's not usually what the automatic calculator's putting in.
Right.
So you do have to fix it.
But just to get a sense, so that way when you're buying a house, think about what can I afford each month reasonably. And you don't want to be like breaking your wallet here. If you can keep it, under, I would say ideally you'd want to keep it to about a third of your paycheck, around there, every month. I wouldn't go over half. I mean, even that's kind of stretching it, but that's about where I would put it. Just as sort of a rule of thumb. I mean, you're going to have to figure out your own budget and how that works, but that's how I always tell people to do it. Think about what it is you can afford reasonably, right, every month. And you got to factor in what are the utilities, if I'm, do I have to get flood insurance on this house because of where it's located, things like that. But you need to ask, and you can ask a realtor about all that stuff. But I think it's a good thing to do. I mean, right now, like I said, the market's still too hot, but there are places where, because of COVID, people have kind of abandoned, and now people are moving back, or not moving back, but there's still, you can get prices. So I know in Oregon, prices have come down pretty rapidly, especially around the Portland area. Not that place, for example. That place is right by the huge private university. But other places around, the city and the metro area have come down pretty significantly. Where, the house was, people were asking $500,000 last year, now they're asking $350,000. And 350 is not a bad score between 3,000 and 350, because you're looking at all in 2,000 to 3,000. So something I think people should think about. Thinking about buying a home, it is a good way to build wealth and move forward. But
Geez, Duncan, but it really does still cycle back to wages, which is sort of where you opened this segment, because you say all in $2,000 to $3,000 per month.
You got to be making $5,000.
You got to be making $5,000, and that excludes a lot of people at this point, because as those prices of those homes have gone up, their wages haven't gone up that much. So more and more people have been sort of shut out of $2,000 to $3,000 per month, unless you're living with 4 roommates, and which you might be fine with doing, but you still got to be able to qualify for that loan, which
right,
you don't do based on the idea, oh, I'm going to get roommates. Lender doesn't care to hear that.
Right. And the other thing too is you got to factor in is if you're buying a cheaper home, like it's 150 or 200,000, it's going to be really small. It's probably going to have problems. And the thing you got to be really careful about is if you're buying a house for the first time and it's old or something, you got to make sure that it's up to shape and you can afford whatever repairs are on there before you negotiate the price. Because if you're walking into a house and it's got I looked at one last year, and the foundation on the house was coming down, and they had said the couple had lived there before had buried like a gas tanker or an oil tanker kind of thing in the backyard to fuel the house. And so I'm like, okay,
that's really common with older homes, and most people don't choose to deal with that part of it and just leave it there. That's very, very common. But a foundation, you can't sit and ignore it.
Well, but even the oil tanker thing, I mean, part of the reason they had to warn me of that is because there was a possible leak, which means it could have contaminated the whole property, which means, I mean, so now you're sitting there like, okay, well, how many hundreds of thousands of dollars or $1 million is it going to cost me to fix up this $400,000, $500,000 house? And is it worth it? No. Not, you know. But once again, I mean, it's just things to think about. I mean, it was just a house I was looking at for a client, but it was just, you know, I basically told him, no, screw that. Because after you buy the house, you got to buy to fix the house. So there's lots of little things that go into it, just to be careful. But it is something I think everybody should think about at some point, because it is a good way to build up wealth. Because what you do is you buy the starter house, and then when you make more money, you roll the equity from the starter house into the new house, which is the old strategy.
It could also be if you're thinking longer term, like, you know, that you're somebody who just wants to buy a place and stay in that place. If that is your intention, it can also be a good way, as I talk to clients about stabilizing their expenses.
Right. Well, everything starts with budgeting, yeah.
Your taxes, right, and it all goes back to it too. Your taxes will increase over time, but eventually, if you choose to stay put in the same house, you can have that paid off, and you can really stabilize your expenses down the pipeline. I know that's many years away, but sitting in retirement, only really worrying about taxes and maintenance of a home versus a rent that's increased and is never going away. That's another way to look at it, looping back to future use budget too.
Right. But if you're also taking it and rolling the equity into a newer house, even though you're taking on, you know, a home with higher cost value, equity value, whatever it is, the beauty is you're rolling the equity in, so the payment's going to be lower because you're putting that down on the loan, the equity from the previous house. So you can roll it into bigger and bigger houses and still keep your payments down, and still potentially, like Lacey said, if you spend it and you do it for 20, 30 years and you're consistent, you could potentially own your home, even though you've switched houses 2 or 3 times. Your final home, the bigger home, you could potentially own that in 20 or 30 years if you're consistent about paying it off and you keep rolling the equity. So, I mean, like I said, that's how the middle class was, part of how they were formed in those countries. They were able to build up a lot of net worth in their homes. So it is a good thing to do, just in general.